All right, good evening, everybody. Here we are with perhaps our last episode on the imagination essay, and everybody's here tonight, so that's fun. Does somebody want to start reading?
I can. I don't mind, but I might do a terrible job.
Okay.
You want to do it, Jed?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. Let us suppose then that one who himself justly estimates the imagination is anxious to develop its operation in his child. No doubt the best beginning, especially if the child be young, is an acquaintance with nature, in which let him be encouraged to observe vital phenomena, to put things together, to speculate from what he sees to what he does not see. But let earnest care be taken that upon no matter shall he go on talking foolishly. Let him be as fanciful as he may, but let him not, even in his fancy, sin against fancy's sense. For fancy has its laws as certainly as the most ordinary business of life. When he is silly, let him know it and be ashamed.
Okay, let's stop there. Let's stop there because I find this just kind of fascinating. Any thoughts, you guys?
I'm curious to hear why you find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, a lot of people, I think, okay, like 65 things going on in my head. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think it's a good thing to make a child feel ashamed, for one thing.
Mm.
And one of the other things that I like that he mentions is let him be encouraged to observe vital phenomena, to put things together, and to speculate from what he sees to what he does not see. It's kind of an apophatic approach, don't you think, Jed?
Yeah, I guess I'm like kind of stuck on his sense of making a child feel ashamed.
Yeah, see,
I think it's an interesting. I don't know if I agree with him, but I don't know if I disagree with him. Let's put it that way. I think like.
Well, do you think there could be a loving way to do that?
I think it opens up a weirder path for me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
that's
see, that's
more
why I
of
said.
a relationship of like shamefulness to creativity. Like it's positive and negative relations. And so let me see, like what would be like an example of shame in art? Like Leaving Las Vegas. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
Long time ago.
Long time ago, right? And I think that the premise, if I'm remembering correctly, is like they drink themselves to death. It's actually a really painful, sorrowful movie, but there's a power in that, right? So I don't think that. So I think that there's like this sense where it's more to help the child establish the right relationship with shame. Right.
Yeah, like I'm like
in a sense where it's like let's say if they do, because I think his warnings against false fancy is really good. Actually, I agree with that. But that's kind of his punctuation on that. Maybe like is a little bit inflected by like his Victorian values.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, I don't even want it. I'm not even sure if I would call it progress, but time has progressed in such a way that when we arrive at that word, we have, I think George MacDonald and us have completely different conceptions.
Like, I think he means something. I think he means something different than what we hear.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And so that's why I want to make a point of it, because a lot of people might just throw the baby out with the bathwater on that. And I think there's more to it. So,
right.
Yeah,
and so this is what I mean by like establishing, like to kind of read him charitably, right? Is to like, there's an establishment of a relationship with shame, right? To where I think there is an appropriate way to feel shame over shameful actions, while at the same time being able to say, you are not shameful. Right?
You're as a person.
Yeah.
Right?
So feeling ashamed, like as long as you're talking about feeling ashamed, there is a positive value to feeling ashamed of shameful behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you shouldn't reinforce negative behavior. Any parent's going to tell you that. Like anybody
Sure.
who had kids, like you don't want to reinforce negative behavior by, laughing when your kid's being a knucklehead, even though sometimes it's funny, right?
Like,
And so you don't want to indulge some of those things that when a child is going down a path that's ultimately harmful for themselves, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of what he's getting at. And,
Yeah,
maybe-
because he says sin. He uses sin in there, like he says sin against fancy sense, right?
but what's weird is he's in fancy. Like, how can you be within the realm of fancy, yet also be and with liberty? Like he's saying, like, let him be fanciful. But even in that fancy, you can still sin against fancy sense. I don't know what fancy sense is.
Yeah, that's in the fantastic imagination.
Okay.
So, hi
Yeah, we-
everybody. Nice to have you
Hi.
with us, Oswald, Gregory, and Lance.
Lance, I know.
Hey.
Yes.
Yeah. What did I just say?
Because I don't think what he's trying to do is he's not trying to put constraints on the child and the child's imaginative process or that fancy, right? That he's trying to unlock that. And there are things that are creative dead ends, right? And
or even like, don't run out into the street. Like,
yeah, that's not a good means of self-expression, right?
Yeah. Might be the last time. Oh heavens.
Yeah, it's like if you just because you enjoy the video game Frogger, remember that one from way back?
Yeah.
Because you like that video game does not mean that you should reenact that video game in your real life as a means of expressing that.
Yeah.
Well,
But,
I'm just sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jason.
Oh no, well, I was just gonna say I feel like I'm a little bit more foreign to, I think, the viewpoint that you're coming from, because when I read this, like, it doesn't bother me at all. I don't know why. Like, I'm not bothered by him saying. I guess I could see where, like, maybe you have a parent that just really, really casts a lot of shame on their child and sends them into some spiral. But I mean, the churches I've been in the past, I remember them saying over and over. They would say it all the time, like, God never casts shame. Like, God will never shame you. And I remember responding like, but what if I do something shameful? Like, what if I rape somebody? Like, what if I did some horrid thing? Like, shouldn't I feel ashamed? And I would, like, in my head, I guess I would want God to make me feel ashamed. Maybe not shameful. Maybe this is just semantics or something. I'm not really sure.
Well, there's a book that I've read by an Orthodox priest called How to Be a Sinner. And he talks about guilt and shame in there. And one of the things he says about shame is a natural reaction to sinful behavior. Like we know when we've done something wrong and we feel ashamed. And then it's also a learned behavior. There are cultural norms that you just, like today, for example, there are certain words we're just not going to say. They would make us feel ashamed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he says that shame is an impetus towards repentance. Guilt, on the other hand, is something that you need to deal with psychologically. Like, you can't be living under the burden of or you shouldn't actually be living under the burden of guilt.
Okay.
You can be guilty, right? Like, if you stole something, you can be guilty. But living under, like, being burdened with that for the rest of your life isn't healthy. And that's why we have forgiveness and repentance, right? So
yeah, and I think that's exactly what I mean, Sherry, when I'm saying, like, establishing a relationship with shame.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there is the positive function of shame, because it's like when we go wandering into territory that we shouldn't, it's that feeling and the sting of that can help spur us onward, right?
Yeah.
But there's a difference between that, and I think in this case, like we're just talking about how a child's imagination is to be encouraged, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
So, you know,
Yeah.
like my son, for example, loves to draw like comic book stuff. He's a fantastic artist. He's a freshman in high school, and his art is exceptional, right?
Cool.
You know, if he came in and showed me something that was like totally out of character for him, like if he's like drawing like violent graphic images or something like that, like I would have to be like, hey, where'd that come from? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's like because it would be out of character. Like that's not the kind of stuff he's into. And B, I would be concerned about, well, what's inspiring this that you would want to draw it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
so
totally.
that would be like an
Yeah.
example of, I think, like what he's talking about is like, because, you know, it's like, then like as somebody who wants to foster my son's creativity, I'm going to ask
Yeah.
like, well, what is it that you want to convey about yourself in your artwork?
Mhm.
Right? And how is that going to be reflective of who you are as a creator? Right. And so it's not like those statements may have a sting to them, but it's not like they're statements that are meant to detract from my son's artistic drives. You know what I mean?
Or to crush them.
Like to just, hey, where are you directing this drive?
Exactly.
Where is that taking you?
Yeah.
And how can we do it better?
Exactly. Like, so in that sense of creativity, like it's really important. Like you need in creativity, you can't just have like total free for all thinking. That's helpful to have episodes of that, but then you have to channel that and put it somewhere. You know what I mean? So you're always having to be kind of guided and directed into something more focused.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a discipline to creativity, and like, you know, like people who are just, I've been to like writers' workshops, right, that were just total garbage, because it's just like, well, write whatever you're feeling. Well, that's cool, but there's a whole element of the craft and the skills that you need to acquire to write effectively and to write beautifully, right? To where it's not just, you know, emotional vomit on the paper. Like, all right, it's not interesting. I have plenty of that on my own. Why would I want to read yours? You got to make all that look there. You got to make it interesting and pretty, or, you know, interesting and disturbing, or whatever it is. Like, give it something that grabs me, you know. That's a skill. And so you can't just be undisciplined in your feeling when you're trying to express yourself effectively, like as George MacDonald does as a writer. Like there's a disciplined process to that. So I think what he's talking about here is like, you know, kind of like being a good sensei, you know, when you're running the dojo.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I like how he says, let him be encouraged to observe vital phenomena, to put things together, to speculate what he sees to what he does not see, to show him the positive and the negative space, right? I think that's great. Like if as a parent, if you can bring that to a child's attention, I think you're giving them a really amazing gift, because there's a lot going on in that negative space oftentimes, right? And it's there that the imagination can truly unfold, something like that.
Yeah. Well, I was actually, right before we jumped on, those like kind of one of the things that I think is hard, I think for me as a creative person, is to sit in that negative space. Right. And I think we all, like, whether we're artistically minded and creatively minded or not, we all tend to have that struggle to stay in the uncomfortable space. But that's where all of that possibility is in that negative space.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a really interesting way to draw. I'm not an artist, okay? Just really not.
Mhm.
But I took a watercolor course once with my daughter, and they did this exercise in negative space where you actually paint the background before you paint the subject. So let's say you're going to do like a landscape with mountains and some trees or whatever. Well, you paint that negative space first, and the subject actually emerges out of the negative space. And I thought that was a really interesting metaphysical
Mm.
principle too,
Mhm.
right? When you because of apophatic theology made me think about it in those terms, right? Because you're talking about the negative space in apophatic theology, and when you do that, that the subject emerges out of it, and I
Yeah.
find that really, really kind of fascinating. Michael Martin wrote in his recent Substack. He wrote. It was funny because we did meditations on the tarot together, and then he said, "Well, I got to run. I gotta check on my bees." And then he actually wrote about it on his Substack, and I thought of it when I was reading that part about, George says to have them look at phenomena in nature. Let me see if I can just find the. He talks about how the bees look after the queen and so on, and he had to put a new queen in, right, for into their permanent home. So he says, after I installed the colonies, 2 of them, I went off to other tasks in order to let the ladies get accustomed to their new home. About an hour later, I returned to see how they were faring. On the front of one hive, I saw a little dark spot about the size of a $50. At first, I thought it was a leaf that had become stuck to the honey super, but on closer inspection, I noticed it was a small cluster of bees. The queen, surrounded by her court. They must have been in the box when I shook the remaining bees out. The court completely surrounded Her Majesty, protecting her from the cold wind. I slid the honey super over and brushed them into the brooding chamber below. The image of them covering her, keeping her warm and safe, has haunted me ever since. So, just from the simple, well, first of all, he made a mistake, right? And then he discovered it. And then after having seen it, he wrote this blog post on Sophia.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's exactly, it seems to me that that's exactly what George MacDonald is hoping for, right? When you take your child out into nature and you let them observe vital phenomena, putting things together and speculating from what he sees to what he does not see, right?
Mm.
Yeah. I have a question kind of regarding that. Because he's talking about just observing the bees, and I guess my question would be like, he said that image haunts, and I wonder if that sort of stuff will haunt us, because part of me was thinking before you even read that was if I wonder if I could go out and observe nature and get an idea of a dog eat dog world or something and see violence. Because even before, when Jed was telling the story about his son, and I was thinking about where he says that in being in his fancy, let him not sin. When he is silly, let him know it and be ashamed. I remember when I was little, there were 2 things that came to my head. One was I remember catching antlions. If you guys know what those are, they look like the little earwigs in Star Trek. They're just these little things that burrow in the sand, and they have claws on there, and ants will fall in their spirals, and then they'll drag them down. I remember catching a bunch of them, and then I wanted to see if they could swim, and they don't swim. They all died. And so, and then another thing that came to my mind, but that seems like a weird form of imagination where I'm like, hey, and I don't know if that's right to think of it that way, but then where something perishes. And then another thing I remembered is, and I don't know why I remember this, is I remember catching a dragonfly, and those things are really hard to catch. And so when I caught it, I didn't want to have to catch it again. So I proceeded to rip its wings off. I remember getting a spanking for that from my mom. which later, like now that I'm older, I brought it up and she apologized for it and was like, "Why would I give you a spanking for that?" But I was glad that she did, because that seemed to me like a necessary course correction, like Jed was talking about or something. Like this is something that's not right to do. But then I wonder if I would have just been left on my own to observe nature, would I ever have got that correction? Because would I just see
Yeah, but he
insects
doesn't
devouring
say.
insects and
Yeah, I mean,
know?
to me anyway, in this little section, he's talking about you being there with the child, right? Obviously, because you're encouraging him to think about certain things. You don't want him to go on talking foolishly. You don't want to let him sin against fancy sense. And when he's silly, you want to let him know and be ashamed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What's interesting, okay. Okay, what's so fascinating is like he's got this kind of edge right in this paragraph, right? Where like he's taking you up to like the kind of the precipice of like the power of the imagination, right? So he's talking about going into the, seeing what is unseen, but by what is seen, and like, getting out into the world and like really developing this what the imagination when it's fully formed is incredibly powerful. Right? And so he's taking you right up to the pinnacle of that. And he's has the child on the pinnacle where you're the child is learning to see the unseen world, right? And they're like at the ragged edge of the sacred is the danger, right?
Yes.
And
Well, yeah.
and I think it's like because he takes this very seriously, like there's an interesting dynamic that the images are lending themselves to, which is like, hey, the imagination is not just like some whimsical force. It is really powerful, and it's important that it's going in the right direction and you understand its hazards when it's misused and abused.
Yeah, well, Jed, the last bit that we read, he talks about where the imagination goes sideways, right? How the imagination can be evil. Well, he actually says evil. And I've read this. I read this in a conversation today, and I read it in the Meditations on the Tarot conversation because I find it really. Where was that now? I wonder if we
skip too far ahead. No.
It was about it was at that part about the girl who stays in to be. Oh, I know. It is further ahead. Here it is. All that has been said then tends to enforce the culture of the imagination, but the strongest argument of all remains behind. For if the whole power of dogmatism should rise against her, and this is where he starts using Sophianic terms for imagination, the imagination will yet work, and if not for good, then for evil. If not for truth, then for falsehood. If not for life, then for death. The evil alternative becoming the more likely from the unnatural treatment she has experienced from those who ought to have fostered her. The power that might have gone forth in conceiving the noblest forms of actions, in realizing the lives of the true-hearted, the self-forgetting, will go forth in building airy castles of vain ambition, of boundless riches, of unearned admiration. The imagination that might be devising how to make home blessed, or to help the poor neighbor, will be absorbed in the invention of the new dress, or worse, in devising the means of procuring it. For if she be not occupied with the beautiful, she will be occupied by the pleasant. That which goes not out to worship will remain at home to be sensual. Cultivate the mere intellect as you may, it will never reduce the passions. The imagination, seeking the ideal in everything, will elevate them to their true and noble service. Seek not that your sons and your daughters should not see visions, should not dream dreams. Seek that they should see true visions, and that they should dream noble dreams. Yeah. Anyway, I thought
That sounds
I
like
thought of that.
Pentecost to me.
What's that?
That sounds like Pentecost to me.
Pentecost. You mentioned that before in one of our conversations.
Yeah, so that they have visions and dream dreams,
Yeah.
Oh,
and how he's linking this directly to
Oh,
that.
that's right. Yeah. See, I knew I heard that somewhere before.
Yeah, like that's like he's drawing. I mean, George MacDonald is clearly drawing a reference to Pentecost there,
Yes, he is. Yes, he totally is.
and that so like to not venture too far into the woo, or maybe we can play with this one for a little bit. But like I think that that's like part of what excites me about these kinds of conversations about the imagination and how it's employed and the purposes for which it's used. Because I think that that is the like we've been talking so much about the AI and the good and the bad side of that, but like to me, there's a deeper spiritual movement than the technological piece. Is like our time, like where the battlefield will be won and lost is for the human imagination.
I think so too. Yeah, I agree.
And because like that is the like Nicholas Berdyaev will talk about, this is the creative vocation of the people, right? And it's like, and the Pentecostal promise is for all flesh, right? That the young and the old. It's not like we're not talking about like this restrictive parochial restriction to the Christian religion. That's not what Pentecost was about. It was this eschatological spirit coming on all flesh. And I think that what we are once upon a time expectation was that this was just going to descend down upon us, and then like we're going to have the same kind of outpourings that we saw at Pentecost, when what that was is a catalyst for something that's supposed to draw us upward and draw our minds and our hearts upward, so that we can see and perceive and then speak and express ourselves from that place. And I think that's how the kingdom that comes, that's our role in it. And our role in bringing it about is through that imagination of imagining, in a sense, what it is, what it can be, and then giving ways to express that. And so
yeah, like
really interesting, like he talks about it in those terms, because that's like that's where the real action is at, I feel like.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, it's like the antithesis is Babel, right, of Pentecost, and because there are tongues at Babel, but they're tongues that are meant for dispersion, and the tongues at Pentecost are the tongues that bring everything together. Yeah, that's interesting. I never even thought of it. I never even thought of it when I read that. Yeah.
Going back to this idea too, I mean, this is mapping for me in a lot of different ways, so I'm going to try to articulate myself. But this idea of constraints, in needing constraints, I'm thinking about poetry. I'm thinking about the nature of like poetic forms and like the classical forms and something like free verse, and juxtaposing someone like Kerouac or Allen Ginsberg and these people in the San Francisco Renaissance who were like, really taking off with this, pre-1960s sort of freedom with, let's get rid of these constraints because they're limiting our creativity, and we need to, move these things out of our way because they're roadblocks. But in reality, there was a certain sense in which that was short-sighted, because we didn't know what to do with the freedom that we had once unlocking the power of the imagination comes with great responsibility, or what have you. It's not one of those things that you like jump into without. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, one of my literature professors when I was in my undergrad program, he was like, I love that you have this passion, Luke, for like I can see you, like, because Kerouac was probably the main literary influence of my you know, high school years or whatever. And then like I brought that into the classroom and he just bashed on it. He was just like, this, like, these guys should not be your heroes. Like, let me bring you back to the beauty of like the phenomenal sonnet writers of, you know, whatever century. And so he's bringing me back into time, and it's like these constraints. And who wrote that comment up above? It was something about like working within an older structure. I like working in existing homes because it's enjoyable to work with the constraints. Every once in a while you lose to one, though. I suppose that.
Yeah, I'll go grab it.
But that whole idea of like working within these tighter confines or these tighter margins, in how that actually fosters creativity. So like when you do have somebody correcting you, it's almost as if they're training you with the responsibilities of the Force. You know, let's bring in a Star Wars reference. And so you've got your Yoda who's teaching Luke Skywalker to like properly use this power that he has, contrary to, you know, and because, you know, you make one false move and you're, you know, you're off the beaten path or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's interesting with that is like there's kind of, you know, it's like some of that's like aesthetic choice. You know what I mean? Like, because Kerouac's pretty rad.
Yeah, no, I love him. He's just not necessarily the moral. I don't know. I love
genius. A moral genius.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess there's like, that's where I get a little bit like, I love the structures too. Like really, truly, like it's fun to work within that. But Kerouac works differently structurally, and like he's not exploring necessarily the kinds of themes that, like, you know, would be deemed spiritual in some crowds and that kind of stuff. Like I really love the poetry of Sylvia Plath. Right? Is she a great moral exemplar? Well, probably not, you know,
Sure.
But like there's a beauty in that they are still able to draw out that I find to be like very interesting. And like sometimes like art tells the truth, even if it's telling the truth about our lies.
Sure.
Well, when you were talking about it, I was thinking about what I just read, you know, like that dogmatism represses the imagination, right? And so you have the people like Jack Kerouac coming out of an era where everything was essentially repressed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people walked around in suit and ties, and it was, you know, leave it to Beaver, and everything was happy, and don't tell anyone any of your problems, right?
Sure.
And so what George MacDonald, and I just really want to pound this home because I think it's so right. What he says is that if you do this to the imagination, then she will, instead of going out to worship, she will stay home to be sensual. Right? But she will work. And I think that's what happened. I mean, right, you know, what happened after the 50s? The 60s.
Yeah.
Right.
And you get this like Dionysian shift the other direction.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. Yeah. And then I was listening to a really good McGilchrist conversation today. And he was talking about the coincidence of opposites. And he said, essentially, you can look at it like this. If you pursue freedom long enough, you will find yourself in tyranny. Because you will, this is how the coincidence of opposites works for him, mm-hmm. is that you will eventually cross that line into the opposite thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is why I think George is in this part of the essay, he's making it clear that there has to be a proper cultivation of the imagination. And anyway, we got a lot out of that little paragraph.
Yeah. I want to piggyback on one little thing here, because I think it plays into the tension we're playing between here,
Mhm.
right? So whether you're going into the great sonnets, which are great, they truly are, right?
Mhm.
And Kerouac, or some of the post-structuralist poetry, right, is that they're playing in two different registers, right? And I like one of the things that like there was like a whole year where all the poetry I was writing was like really trying to play with the concepts of motion and stillness, because like I had been reading some mystical theology type stuff that perfect motion is the same thing as perfect stillness, right? And so like at the divine level, you see the perfect coincidence of both. They're the same thing, right?
Mhm.
But then you get into the created realm and they're different, right? Just like function or form. And then there's the chaotic principle, right? And you can find beauty there too.
Sure.
Like it's a more combustive force, but there's beauty to be had there. And there's the more structural forms. And sometimes it's really cool when you can mix the two, and that can become a creative ferment for more different possibilities when you can dip in and out of structure.
Mm.
Right. And so like, and I think that like I guess that's how I approach art and creativity is like a little of this and a little of that,
Yeah.
it's like if it's like biscuits, right? If you overwork your biscuits, you got crappy biscuits, right? So you need just enough. And so that's kind of like where like I don't know. I like the ideas that, it's like we do have our aesthetic judgment and our personal tastes that are definitely involved in the creative act. And that's something we should be bringing to the table, but also like have the appreciation or the ability to appreciate somebody else's aesthetic and
Mhm.
to see the beauty in it. If there is beauty, I mean, there is times where the imagination will go into a dark place and it's just like, yeah, that's not for me,
Mhm.
but yeah, I think that there's kind of that place where it's like, I think your professor is like half right. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, the songs are amazing. And, like working in iambic pentameter and writing in meter and having a rhyme scheme and all the things that are, really essential to the craft of poetry. But there's more than that. Just like there's classical music and there's jazz,
Exactly. And I think one of the things that does occur, and maybe this was a T.S. Eliot insight, is inevitably these things do collapse back into form because it's like this inevitable thing. So even when you're writing free verse and there's a certain way in which you feel like you're um, liberated beyond the confines of anything that's holding you back, there's still you're still operating within a language, or you're operating within music or whatever. Like it's just you're collapsing into something like meter naturally when you're writing a free verse poem or something like that. So that's always been my like thought process. And like Jason, even earlier, he mentioned like if you were to leave the child alone in nature, would nature inevitably like sort of like form that child's
Well, I
imagination
have a
close the
story.
limits? And I would think that it would.
It does. It does. I have a story. So I caught we gave my son a BB gun when he was 12, and we were living in, no, he was 10. We were living in Telegraph Creek. And I caught him shooting songbirds off of the clothesline one day, and I was really pissed. I was really mad, just like Jason's mom, but I didn't spank him.
I would have been
Instead,
shooting the birds too. Like I don't know what it is with
well,
boys. I would have been like, "That's what it's for."
that's well, I mean, you don't want to just shoot around at nothing, right? You want to shoot at something, and you're supposed to kill things. So whatever you're shooting at should be alive to start out with, right? Like, it's just logical. So instead of getting angry, and I did. Well, I mean, I told him, I said, I don't mind if you shoot things with your gun, but don't shoot innocent songbirds. I said, here, I have a job for you. And I was rehabilitating a hawk. And so I said, I need a squirrel. Can you go get me a squirrel? And he was like, oh, yeah. So, totally, right? Big gun, big hunter. And I did that to him every day for 2 weeks, every single day. Now, I didn't need a squirrel every day, but I just put them in freezer bags and threw them in the freezer for the hog. And after 2 weeks, he came to me and he goes, "Mom, I don't want to shoot squirrels anymore." I said, "Why not?" "Well, first he didn't really want to show his cards, so he said, "Well, I killed most of the ones around the house, and now I have to go further out, and I'm scared of bears, and And then I said, "Okay. Anything else?" "Well, they don't always die right away, Mom." I said, "Okay."
Mm-hmm.
And that was nature teaching him.
Yeah, that's how it worked. I remember it because I was thinking, like, when I was a kid, like, we had pellet guns and BB guns and that kind of stuff. And when you first get them, as a boy. I mean, it's like almost instinct. You're out there, and it's like,
Yeah.
if it moves, I want to get some lead or some copper on it, And but I remember I was maybe like 8 or 9, so I didn't go through the period for very long, but I came up on like a bird that I had shot in the backyard, and because my family were all hunters, like my dad and my grandpa and my uncles. Like, I went on hunting trips, and you're kind of wanting to like do what they do. But I remember like coming up on a bird that I had shot, and I could see it suffering. And I never did shoot. I've never shot anything else. I mean, I've done target practice and like that kind of stuff, because I'm not a gun owner myself, but I do enjoy going out to the shooting range, but like, I can't bring it to, for me, like, I remember the feeling of like I had transgressed something, and it was the first time I had seen it. And then I'm like, oh shit. And I've killed all these birds, and I did that to every single one of them. And it wasn't like I felt bad, because I still would go on hunting trips with my dad, and there were times that we'd take deer and that kind of stuff. And like, I didn't have a problem with that, because I knew we were putting it to use. Like, we were gonna use this. It was kind of exchange there. But it was just like, oh wow, just like the pleasure I would take in the violence felt like, even as a young kid, I remember I felt shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting is I knew that this urge had to just play itself out, and I was using all the squirrels. Okay, it wasn't he was bringing them home, and I was using them all for my hawk, and it was all good, but I knew it had to play itself out. And he was a hard nut to crack. But he still goes when he comes home. He'll get the gun, and he'll go out and he'll get a couple grouse and cook them up for dinner, and but he has a different approach to it now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an anti-hunting guy or anything like that. I just know that for me, that was the last animal.
He's never hunted, like he's never hunted big game, like or deer or anything like that. He's bird hunts, grouse and whatever. But yeah.
Cool. Do you want me to go into the next paragraph?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So we are at where this association with nature is but occasionally possible, resource must be had to literature. In books, we not only have store of all results of the imagination, but in them, as in her workshop, we may behold her embodying before our very eyes. In music of speech, in wonder of words, tell her work, like a golden dish set with shining jewels and adorned by the hands of cunning workmen, stands finished before us. In this kind, then, the best must be set before the learner, that he may eat and not be satisfied. For the finest products of the imagination are the best nourishment for the beginnings of that imagination.
Wow.
And the mind of the teacher must mediate between the work of art and the mind of the pupil, bringing them together in vital contact of intelligence, directing the observation to the lines of expression, the points of force, and helping the mind to repose upon the whole, so that no separable beauty shall lead to a neglect of the scope, and that the shape or form is complete. and he must seek to show excellence rather than talk about it, giving the thing itself that it may grow into the mind, and not a eulogy of his own upon the thing, isolating the point worthy of remark rather than making many remarks upon the point.
Mm.
Yeah, that's heavy.
Yeah. It's good, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't even know where to begin. It just reminds me of the exact opposite of how I approach everything in life. I'm always too quick to say something, and like too, instead of letting something ferment in age properly or something like that, or giving it the proper nourishment that it needs. It's like I'll cut it off right at the root. Try to jumpstart it.
Yeah. That paragraph makes you want to stand in silence for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I guess I won't be silent for long.
Go for it, Dad. Go for it.
A little bit of play in the creativity here. No, like where I think he's like so spot on is like the relationship between the teacher and the student,
Mm-hmm.
the mediating role, right? And like, what are you bringing the student into contact with? Right. And I think that this can go well, even like if you're kind of the kind of person who's like more of a self-directed learner, right? Where you have a different relationship with the learning, right? Is like, what are you putting yourself into contact with? And like, because that's all going to become the source material for, if you're driven to create, that's going to be the source material you're working from. Right. So example, like from education where I was teaching, there's like when I was in the high schools, maybe like it's been a while, so music taste may have changed, but 7, 8, 9 years ago. Right. And like what I observed, like there was like a mumble rap movement, and like, so rap kind of went from like hardcore hip hop from the streets to like this more like almost like emo type stuff. Like it was really like exploring dark emotions and talking about the trials and tribulations that they're facing, but not particularly. I like hip hop and rap music, so it's not like I'm against it, but I just didn't find this to be very helpful, because like what I would watch is like how my students would emulate that. Right. And like it turned into like when they would start talking about the music, it was like this collective pity party around a series of trauma bonds. Right. And it was like, but there was enough of a creative patina around it where there was an appeal, because it had like a compelling sound to it. Like it was interesting for sure. But, that's where I was just like, I took them back to like some of like the hip hop that I liked in the 90s. Right. So, and just saying like, well, look at what these guys are doing lyrically, so it's like kind of that redirect that was maybe in the prior paragraph is like, hey, I'm not saying like all this stuff is terrible, but like, like some of these rappers were trying to take on society itself. Like that's pretty rad too. You know what I mean? So like there's these interplays where like, what are you putting yourself into contact with? And I had a few students who were like actually kind of talented musicians. And so what I encouraged them to do was to read, is like expose yourself to different kinds of art forms, because that's going to like give you more of a palette that you can work with. Like, so put yourself in contact with cool books and put yourself in contact with cool films, because there's a multiplier there. And so there's, like the source material becomes, even if we're not talking in necessarily spiritual dimensions here, just at a practical educational level, like you have to mediate. You got to help put your students in contact with good source material.
Yeah.
Because I'm not like one of these kids in their music these days. Like I enjoy their music, but it's like, you can see, I could see what it was doing to my students psychologically, like what register they were occupying. And it's like, I mean, you guys would be better off with more of like the oppositional stuff, at least, get you moving,
Yeah.
So it was kind of an interesting way to explore that. But I just think that the mediation role that the teacher has to play is massive.
There's the way that he phrases this. He says the mind of the teacher must mediate between the work of art and the mind of the pupil, bringing them together in the vital contact of the intelligence, directing the observation to the lines of expression, the points of force. I can totally relate to this in a couple of ways. Like when I'm training horses, you have this sense that you're communing with another, the consciousness of another being, right? And you can actually feel yourself being, you can feel your consciousness enter into their consciousness. This is going to sound really weird, but you can feel it, and you can feel their consciousness enter yours. And I think it's super tangible with animals because they don't talk, so there's nothing to interfere with that experience, right? And it feels like a moment of contact. And it's right at that. It's kind of like we talked about last time, Jason, when we were talking about harmonics and tuning guitars, and you hear the in between, right? The vibration of those harmonics. As soon as that contact is made, that's when whatever it is you're trying to transmit to the animal, in the case of the horse, that's when you have to do it. Right at that moment. And then the horse, if they get it, they do this lick and chew. So, and it's kind of like a self-soothing thing, but it tells you that they understood. Right? So when you're training a horse and you have this moment of contact, you watch for the lick and chew, and then you know that they have it. And but you can also feel it. You can feel these consciousnesses touching. And I imagine someone like George MacDonald, could you imagine if he was your dad and he was teaching you something? It must be like that.
I probably would have ran away from home. I'd be like, Dad, what do you think? I got it.
Pulls a little fairy out of his pocket. Look, I brought a friend. No, and I think a really good teacher can do that with his students. You know, he can kind of, without a whole lot of blah blah blah, he can get them to that place where that contact is made, right? And then he just watches for the lick and chew on the other end, and lets them go with it, right? And like, I know as a parent, one of the things that I always did with my kids, and even as they got, like when they were little, it was easy. If I didn't want them to do something, I would change their mind. So I would literally just turn their bodies and go, look at that. And they'd go, because they were so simple to distract. They would very quickly though, as soon as I'd say, hey, did you see that? They'd go, I don't want to look at that. And they'd look back to the thing that they were looking at, right? Because then they started started cluing in. And so I had to get more and more creative about, look over there, look at and I get the sense that this is really culturing the imagination, So like as they got older, I couldn't just say, why don't you go do that? I had to say, come on, let's go catch tadpoles
Mhm.
with them. I couldn't just send them on their own, right? And anyway, all that stuff just came to my mind. And then he says here, directing the observation to the lines of expression, the points of force. I know when I'm reading, and George MacDonald, I can do this with George MacDonald because he has such long sentences, and he's got all these commas and these little descriptive phrases in between. And I'll often just go back and just condense the sentence to its, to its actual meaty substance. So you could say, the cat, it was black and shiny and it ran really fast, ate, right? Well, what is the sentence saying? It's saying the cat ate. But we often get, lost in all the description.
Yeah.
And and for myself, because I'm an autodidact, right? I didn't finish high school. I never went to post-secondary school or anything. And so when I'm reading, I often have to do that with the sentences. I have to just get rid of all the clauses and just find the noun and the verb, maybe an adjective. I'll leave an adjective or two in there. And then I can take those main ideas and use them as these, he says, points of force. And I see a lot of in writing, like, not, you can't do this with poetry, but if you're reading something like this, for example, this essay, I can use it as stepping stones to skip my way. It doesn't always work because sometimes I miss a whole lot if I do that, right? I read really, really fast. And so sometimes I have to force myself to slow down because I think I know everything because I can just, But anyway, and I get this image of these points of force, right? Boom, 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 and you start seeing this pattern in the literature. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
I sat in an interesting. So I have a couple of friends that have done work with Pixar back when they were Pixar Studios, and they talked about their screenwriting. And it was really interesting. Like he said, yes, like our goal as we're crafting our scenes is roughly, he says, at about a 2-minute interval, we want to raise a question in the audience's mind.
Oh, wow. Like,
what is this character going to do next? So they'll present a problem or present something that raises a new question. And it's like this, and the technique and the method is meant to really pull you, like it's more of a film writing technique than it is like and obviously they're writing films for children. And so they're trying to hold their attention. And so they're spacing like these basically driving questions. And it's these certain questions that are actually driving the plot and the character development forward.
Yeah.
And I think that so when you're teaching something, what's really fun, like when you're in a situation where you have the opportunity to teach people, is that point of contact, like you're talking about, where you're at the same vibrational wavelength, like the consciousnesses kind of converge and you can tell that they're getting it. Like that's like when you're teaching something, that's where the reward of teaching is.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, isn't it, Jed? Because it's not something that is tangible, but you can feel it.
And it's usually because when you're teaching it, they're catching the thrust of the question, the force of an argument. Right. And so like when I read, like that's what I'm looking for, is like, where is this going? Like, what is the point that this author is trying to say to me?
Yeah, that's
they drawing my attention toward, and like, and like, but like not just like, some of this like gets into like one of my pet peeves at like reading comprehension tests, right? Because I used to have to administer testing in schools, and I'm looking at this and I'm like, we're actually not teaching people to read. we're teaching them to see all the trees and miss the forest,
Yeah.
right? And so like so it's like you've got to be able to like pan out and get that big picture of what it is that is being conveyed in something that's being written, poem, narrative, essay, whatever it is, the Bible. You know, like
Yeah.
you got to be able to pan in and pan out. So there's like this multi-optic,
Yes.
like in cultivating, back to the question of vision, like you have to be able to have that kind of the ability to have the telescopic view, and even like a panoptic view where you can be playing with multiple images at the same time. And so
Yeah.
cultivating and developing vision is really fascinating.
It is. Yeah.
Like it's really fun to like watch. There's some great YouTube essays, like film criticism essays, where they'll go in and they'll pick apart a film and they'll talk about like how it was shot and like what the director, what the filmmakers are trying to convey in a scene, and they'll get into lighting and all these different things. Like the camera itself becomes like this, the vision itself becomes like a medium of communication.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like really cool when when you're teaching that and you can see them catch that. It's like, oh, this is really this is what this work of art or this work of literature is trying to impart to you.
You got any thoughts, Jason? You're awfully quiet.
Yeah. I put my thoughts were kind of going, I think, where what Jed was kind of talking about, and he says, so that no separable beauties shall lead to a neglect of the scope.
Right.
And when he's talking about like books, like all books, like it's kind of, you can weave in and out and collect from like a what is the right word? Like a global imagination or something. I don't know the right, collective imagination of everybody, and to not get hung up on one separable beauty, because you have separable beauties. But the thing that kept coming to my mind the first time you read it is he says this phrase, and I think he's talking, where is it? Where was it? Gosh, where is it? The cunning workman. He says something, cunning workman. Anyways, I think he's quoting Song of Solomon. And that's why I didn't know, because Song of Solomon says that he uses that same phrase, and he's describing a woman, and he says she's like the work of the hands of a cunning workman. And then he goes to describe all these particulars of a woman where you could get hung up on one separable beauty and miss the whole of the woman in her completeness. And I think he might actually be, this paragraph is actually kind of a play on that chapter in a way, because he's talking about the imagination as a woman, and he's referring to her. And I think it's,
that's cool.
I don't know where that phrase is, but I can read it really quick if you want.
Is that in
it's not long.
Please do.
No, it's in Song of Solomon.
Oh, Song of Solomon. Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's the woman in Song of Solomon, but he says, how beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. The curves of your thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of a cunning workman. Your navel is a rounded goblet, it lacks no blended beverage. Your waist is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like the ivory tower. Your eyes are like the pools of Heshbon by the gates of Bath-Rabim. Your nose is like the tower of Lebanon, which looks toward Damascus. Your head crowns you like Mount Carmel, and the hair of your head is like purple. A king is held captive by your tresses. And then he goes on to describe her. But I think that some of it too is like each thing he's describing is like a whole different scene or scenario in a different, like almost realm of beauty that you could get lost in, lose the scope of the whole picture in a way too. So like you could get lost in what her nose is like the Tower of Lebanon, and you get lost in that tower or something.
It sounds like a big note.
That's just kind of what came to my mind, and it was just that one phrase. I don't know where it was though, but I lost it now. It was in that paragraph, and he said that phrase, "cunning workman." Yeah, I don't know. That was my thought. Oh, there it is. In Music of Speech and Wonder of Words, till her work, like a golden dish set with shining jewels and adorned by the hands of a cunning workman,
Mhm.
stands finished before us.
Golden dish. Oh yeah, that's exactly what he uses in there.
Yeah, her
The
navel
golden
is like,
dish.
yeah.
Yeah. Golden dish set with shining jewels. Yeah, that's exactly right. There's in the Hidden Life poem, he says, "And when the winter came, when thick the snow armed the sad fields from gnawing of the frost, when the low sun but skirted his far realms and sank in early night, he drew his chair beside the fire, and by the feeble lamp read book on book, and wandered other climes, and lived in other lives and other needs, and grew a larger self by other selves." I love that description.
That's really good.
Yeah.
I'm reading like a really fascinating book right now, and it's kind of it's just I was like literally reading a couple of paragraphs. So this is a theologian or a New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes, and the book is Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul. And what's really interesting, so what he talks about, and like this is literally what MacDonald's doing in this text, is he talks about intertextuality and how Paul oftentimes will take a little phrase from the Old Testament and use it in really like an interesting way that is not necessarily related to the point that the passage was trying to make, but it's just kind of his linguistic background. So he's pulling these intertextual phraseology in, and he uses like an example of from the book of Job, and I won't get into the example, but where in Philippians, Paul's talking about his relationship to his chains, right? And he's talking about how he like he's also sees like these guys out preaching, but kind of out of spite, but nonetheless like he feels like he's going to overcome. And there's this really clear echo from the book of Job and Job's relationship with his interlocutors who are kind of falsely maligning him in his innocence before God. But at no point does he make a textual citation. It's just he's using these images, and then he's pulling them up and he's using them in a different way, in a different context. Point, draw the connection. And like that Pentecostal passage or here, the Song of Songs.
Yeah. I'm so glad there's a couple guys here with good knowledge of the scriptures, because I wouldn't have seen those at all. And what
he's doing is this like this, it's this, he's practicing what he preaches.
Yeah.
Right? Because
totally.
he has he's drawing up of these deep wells in literature, in scripture, and like, I don't think that when he's writing that paragraph, he's like, I'm going to refer in this passage.
No, it's just flowing out of him.
It comes right out of him.
Yeah.
Because that's deep inside of him. Like that imagery is locked in there. And so I don't think like as an author, it may be intentional. Like sometimes you can be intentionally working with source material and trying to build off of it. But like sometimes where it's like embedded in a text like that, like what he's doing, whether he's aware of it or not, is he's teaching his own method.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, the reason we started this was because I said, if we read through this and then read Phantastes, you'll actually see a lot of what's in this essay come to life in the book.
Yeah.
Right? He's constantly doing that embedding thing. And I remember we read Lilith. I read Lilith on my own, and then we read it together with a bunch of people on the BOM Discord, on the writer server. And Andrew with the bangs was in the group, and she was just like, "Sherry, you read this already. What's going to happen next?" And who is she? You got to tell us who she is. And I thought, I never even asked that question when I was reading the book. Who is she? She's Lilith, right? So now, because Andrea is asking the question, I'm thinking, well, I should actually, who is she? She must be somebody.
Mhm.
And then one day he was describing what she was wearing, and I thought, oh, I've heard this before. And I went to the Whore of Babylon in Revelation, and sure enough, it was the same description. And I was like, oh my goodness. And then the next week I was all excited. I said, Andrea, I know who she is. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there it is again, right? He embedded that image into the story, and
Because
in
it was
such a
embedded
subtle way.
because it was embedded in him.
Yeah.
And like what I
Yeah.
love specifically about Lilith as a character, not just the book, but as the character, is that she's such a sympathetic character.
Yeah, and guess
And
what?
that's
I
like,
learned something about the Whore of Babylon that I didn't know before because I was reading Lilith.
mhm.
Because he was not only talking about Lilith, but he was also talking about the Whore of Babylon. Because Lilith, Adam cuts her hand off so that she can sleep, right?
Mhm.
He and she wants to, she just wants, and she's trying to open that hand that she could never open, and it's been closed for so long she can't do it, and she says, cut it off. So I've always had an image of the Whore of Babylon transforming into the bride of Christ. Not, we have all this destructive language in Revelation,
Mhm.
but I think, well, George MacDonald talks like God. Not that he is God, but he speaks in those kinds of riddles where the destruction is actually transformation. And so the transformation does rid you of the thing. It's never going to be there again, right? It's been destroyed. But that's not because it's gone. It's because it's been transformed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This is so
I
helpful
think you're
because
right.
I've heard Jason mention that similar thing, that
Yeah.
the Whore of Babylon being transformed into the Virgin.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I say they're all the same Mary. That's why I'm always saying that. And we're probably going to get in trouble someday.
Exactly.
But Isaiah chapter 34 is the only verse in the Bible I think that actually says the word Lilith. It talks about kind of a deserted wilderness.
Mhm.
And you see that in the book of Lilith, what George MacDonald is doing. And then chapter 35 in Isaiah, it says, the wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. And so you see the restoration of the wilderness. And I think that's what he's doing in the book of Lilith, is he's saying,
Yeah, because one of the key things,
whore is being restored to a virgin.
right? Yeah, and one of the key things, Jason, for me was the waters under her feet. The Whore of Babylon has the waters under her feet, and Lilith has all the waters under her feet, right? Like he can, through the whole book, he can hear the waters gurgling under the ground, right? But there's no water on the surface anywhere. Like the people have no water. She only has water in her palace or something like that, a fountain or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Anyway, that's good. I didn't ever notice that before. Probably this theologically profound book I think I've ever read. It is so good. And Ezekiel, I'm actually in Ezekiel right now, and I stopped because I wanted to I got to chapter 16, which is probably it's either that or Ecclesiastes 12, which is my favorite chapters in the Bible. But Ezekiel chapter 16 is just like, if you want to sum it all up in one chapter, that's the virgin becoming the whore, becoming the virgin again. Just all
really
in one chapter.
It's like
what's
wild about Ezekiel, like 16 and 17, is that is literally some of the most graphic imagery. Like maybe the book of Judges has got a little bit more on it, but that's about it. Like in terms of just how graphic it is. And
is 17 the dry bones?
No, 17 has to do with the redemption of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, okay.
And so that there's this really fascinating I mean, Ezekiel, like in a sense, I'm not saying this to denigrate him, and I mean this in the best sense, but there are some times when he sounds rather psychotic, right? And but it's like it's almost like there's this prophetic like pressure that builds up and it explodes out of him. And like you can feel it. You can feel his trauma from the exile and the loss of the temple. And like as a priest, which he was in the priestly class, like as a priest, just like the sheer devastation that he's living with in his own community. And so you can see why some of like that, like when you're in that state of grief, there are times where your grief is like almost totally irrational. And like and so you can feel that in his poetry, which is it's really interesting to read through Ezekiel. But at the same time, like he's seeing the same thing that MacDonald is seeing, right?
Yeah, and how can you see it if you don't have how can you see that if you have no imagination, right? Like the easiest conclusion to come to is that destruction means destruction. It means atomic bombs, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the thing that, or a forest fire or whatever, and then everything's ash and it's gone. But what if destruction actually, like this is where the book of Job gets really interesting too, because Job says, well, wait, I've seen a tree. I've seen a shoot growing out of a stump.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's his imagination, right? And he goes, well, maybe there's life after death,
Yeah.
And so what if destruction is not destruction? What if it's transformation? Oh, and then go, page back to or ahead to, the crucifixion. And you're like, yeah, that's what's happening here. It's not death and destruction. Right? He's resurrected and transformed. That's what the story's all about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's read this last sentence because we didn't. It says, and ever he must seek to show excellence rather than talk about it. Farmer talk. That's farmer talk. Giving the thing itself, that it may grow into the mind, and not a eulogy of his own upon the thing. Isolating the point worthy of remark, rather than making many remarks upon the point. Isolating the point worthy of remark.
Yeah. And you might not even make a remark about it. In fact, in the process of isolating it, you're choosing not to speak of it. Maybe he just points at it.
Rilke's really good at that.
It's more powerful than uttering it. Like a wise man does not speak all he knows or all he sees. It's like if you might be able to
in a negative space.
Yeah, the apathetic thing. That
kind of like Jed was talking about with the question too and stuff like
that. Yeah.
Wow.
It's been the theme of this whole episode.
Yeah. Yeah, we started out talking about the angels and demons thing on my whatever they call those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, there's a little tiny paragraph here, this one sentence long. Especially must he endeavor to show the spiritual scaffolding or skeleton of any work of art, those main ideas upon which the shape is constructed and around which the rest group as ministering dependencies. Especially he must endeavor to show the spiritual scaffolding or skeleton of any work of art. I wonder if he's thinking of the Valley of Dry Bones there, Jason.
Yeah, I was just wondering that too. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes that makes me think of it as well, where it says, you do not know the way of the wind, or the bones of that are in the womb of her who's with child. I think we mentioned this last time too, and Luke was talking about, he brought up dry bones, or maybe it was in the Voxer group. But that always makes me think of the womb, where Luke was talking about, like, even the earth, your burial, your tomb ends up being the womb. And so you have like all the bones of like all humanity is like kind of waiting expectantly in the womb of her who's with child. They're all the dry bones, like the book of Ezekiel, like you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, it's also what's interesting is he's basically, I mean, I don't know if they would have, I don't know where the field of education was at when he was writing this, but like scaffolding comes straight out of educational psychology today. That
Oh, no
your,
kidding.
your lesson plan is built with scaffolding, right? And so
That
what
was an architectural metaphor.
right, so what you're trying to do is get around the superstructure of the thing that you're trying to teach, and you're building around it with concepts that are related that help drive the students to the structure. And like, so I think, and like so I think the skeleton there too, like, I mean, definitely, you know, Valley of Dry Bones, I think is there, but I think what he's trying to drive at is like whether it's a poem or a book or a work of art, there's a structure to all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you're trying to foster creativity, what you need to be able to show is structurally how it's working. Right. So like my son with his art, like he does a lot of like, and like a friend who worked at Pixar, I was like, yeah, my son wants to maybe be an animator someday. He says, well, just get him on YouTube. There's like 1 million art channels that'll teach you all kinds of technique.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he's in there, like a lot of like his sketchbook is just him practicing techniques, whether that's human figures or hands or different poses and all that kind of stuff. It's scaffolding into the thing that he like. So he gave me like this really like super rad, like Star Wars themed comic book for Father's Day the other year, like last year, I want to say. And it just, he practiced, like he showed me all of his practice sheets where he came up with the idea. And then he showed, and I always like the practice stuff better because I love to see what's going on inside of his little head, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got the finished product, and it's just this
Cool,
really amazing artwork.
that's beautiful.
And like, and so, you know, like I think what he's driving at there is like, if you're going to teach somebody to be creative, they have to understand how creativity works. They got to get inside the chambers of the Nautilus, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where he's like, one of the things he's driving at is like, when you're imparting and when you're teaching creativity, is you're not just wanting them to like appreciate it. So he talks about, and that's where he does that weird lensing. He wants you to see the whole thing and step back and see the whole and appreciate it. But then he wants you to get inside of it, see how it's put together. And that's another way that you, like, as a creator, as a creative person, become more effective in your craft.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And so I think like that's part of what he's getting at. And I think it's like, what's really interesting is I know that like that wasn't necessarily a part of educational psychology in the Victorian age, but he's basically, he's
describing it,
sketching out exactly what the way like a good educator would work.
Yeah. It makes me think of like like I'm a very process oriented person, which maybe that wouldn't be immediately obvious, but for me, it's like, if I've learned the process, you can put me in any situation and I will be able to apply that process regardless of all the different variables that, you know, so if I've, you know, framed in a house and it doesn't matter if the architect changes the plans, I know how to work from, you know, the plans that are given to me, and I know all the processes that will go along with framing the structure or what have you, or even tiling. Like, it's great with all the construction metaphors or whatever, because it's so easy to tile a shower, and it doesn't matter if you change the format of the tile or you put the niche somewhere else or whatever. It's I'm going to follow these same processes and procedures that I use to create this flawless work of art at the end. I mean, not flawless, it's going to have its imperfections, but the
Don't
point
sell
is,
yourself short.
the point is is that it's gonna be I'm not really changing much in the kind of scaffolding that I'm using to make that happen.
Yeah.
But I'm actually I can apply it to a greater multiplicity of scenarios, and I'm actually becoming more adaptable in that process, not less adaptable. You know, I'm not becoming more rigid. I'm becoming less rigid. you
Yeah, I
know?
think that's just mastery, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and like in the building stuff, in the building world, like I've grown up on pretty large construction sites. Like, so we
Mhm.
did a lot of mid and high rise type work. You know, as plumbers, like you're not involved in the scaffolding, you're really in the guts of the building, right? But what's cool is like you get to the finish phase of the building where they're starting to kind of put all the finished material on the building, and whether it's siding or glass. I especially love the glazers. That's such a cool process to see them get those windows up into those high rises. Well, the way they do it is with scaffolding. They have to build a structure around the building. So if you want to know how the scaffolding eventually disappears and the building is all that remains, right? So it's
Yeah.
not like the scaffolding is the main point, but if you want to know how that structure got put together, well, level 1, level 2, level 3, it had to involve a process, an accumulative process to get to where they went, to that finished
Mhm.
product.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting about it is the building is not about the scaffolding any more than the body is about the skeleton. But if you have an understanding of what the skeleton is, if you have an understanding of the scaffolding and the bones and the structure of a building, it tells you a lot about the building itself.
Yeah.
Right? It's not the whole thing, and it's not even necessarily going to tell you all about its aesthetic, but it will give you opening to see how that aesthetic is expressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, George also, like, the thing that I love to quote, where he says the world is the human being turned inside out, right? A wardrobe with which we clothe our thoughts. I always had an image of what do they call those things seamstresses use, with the dummy, the clothes, the mannequin or whatever, that they can put the clothes on to measure and
Mm-hmm.
pin and
Mm-hmm.
and so on. Yeah, it's a similar, and there is a concept in I remember talking to I'm trying to think of his last name now, Matthew. He used to be on the Matt. He used to be on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. I think he actually had a conversation with Karen Wong today. And he writes, and he was telling me that basically you find yourself a skeleton
Mm-hmm.
and then you clothe it, right? And every skeleton is basically the same. It's a certain structure, right? And then you can put different clothes on it, right? And that's kind of the way he approached storytelling, and that's what I thought of when I read that little, especially must he endeavor to show the spiritual scaffolding or skeleton, those main ideas upon which the shape is constructed and around which the rest group as ministering dependencies.
How does he come up with that?
I don't know.
This may not be related. I don't know how to relate it. It just popped up into my head, so it's totally random thought. We could just throw it. But when you were talking about nature and kind of clothing a mannequin, and how nature is clothing for our thoughts, think of Peter Pan. In Peter Pan, again, he's clothed with leaves. Then you mentioned the skeleton, and he's actually clothed with skeleton leaves, is what it says. I don't know. That was just a random
Skeleton
thought.
leaves?
Maybe, yeah. I don't know what that means, but
Yeah,
that could just be a bad thing to bring into this conversation. I don't know. So it might go nowhere. That was just something that popped into my head that I hadn't really thought about before.
Huh.
Clothed
I
with
want to go back to Luke's question for a second of like, how did he do that?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to ignore your question, Jason, at all, but my mind kept going back to like what he asked, like, how did he do that?
Yeah.
And like, I think it's like there's like an ineffable explanation that I won't even attempt,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a practical side of this. Is George MacDonald spent his whole life looking and seeing.
Mm-hmm.
He was a man of vision. He paid attention to things. He paid attention to the whole. He paid attention to the parts. He paid attention to how it got put together, how it falls apart. In everything he writes. He has this profound sense of a guy who looked deeply and had vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how he did that. Right. And it's like, I mean, I was going to come up with like a snide comment of like, well, he didn't spend much time on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like there's a certain kind of attention that you have to develop, and it's really hard in our time. We're faced with a barrage of images and demands on our attention in ways that probably no humans have just never been this bombarded with attentional issues, right?
Yeah.
And like we live in that world where it's really hard to hold focus, but like in terms of like what he cultivated, well, you know, like if you want to write like George MacDonald, you've got to read like George MacDonald. You've got to get out in nature like George MacDonald. Like you have to immerse yourself in this world.
You got to watch. Like he says here in that first paragraph we read, he says, observe vital phenomena, put things together, speculate from what you see to what you do not see. You know, like he's looking in all the nooks and crannies, right?
Yeah. And so what I like about this, and that's where like that I really loathe the idea that creativity is some spontaneous thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's inspiration, and that's cool. Inspiration is not creativity. Creativity is a much more rigorous process.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it takes effort and toil, and you know, it takes being comfortable in the terrifying silence. You know,
Well,
and like that's where that comes from. It's like the reason why most of us don't touch into that capability is we don't spend the time to cultivate that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
and that capacity can, we've talked about scale in the past, but I like for like even like people don't even realize what they're capable of in regards to their own creativity. And so it's like I surprise myself all the time by like unlocking this new level of like, oh, I'm actually capable of like taking on even more, because you know, it's like, okay, I used to draw pictures on a 10 by, you know, whatever, what's a standard sheet of paper? I don't know.
8.5 by 11 or something.
Yeah. And they were, you know, I'd spend detail, you know, you could spend hours, weeks, months just drawing one picture, and then you'd scale that up in art class, and maybe you have like a larger canvas you're working with. But then when like your canvas does become like a you know, the building of your own home, or I don't even know, carving out a homestead, or building a skyscraper, or like who even knows, like what else? I'm probably not even capable of contending with the possibilities. But I know for me, I'm taking on these larger projects, and I'm like, okay, this is taking a lot more time, effort, and energy to put this together, but the end result is way more I don't even know how impressive, or maybe even that's the wrong word, but it's like it's so much grander than I ever could have given myself the capacity to realize at a younger age or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
When
Well,
I
like,
started,
it's such a cool thing to like the building trades again. Like you're seeing the architect's vision come to life, and like it's through this collaborative enterprise. Because there's very rarely, unless you're talking about like maybe like custom home builders that will do everything. There's very few
Yeah.
construction projects where somebody's doing the whole thing themselves. Like it's going to
Yeah.
involve like coordinating trades, and there's this dance and this art to it that's really cool. And it's
Yeah.
collaborative too, and that's what's really interesting is like how does creativity scale? Well, it's in collaboration. There's a
Yeah.
unified vision behind it all, but you
Mhm.
have to like you have to be willing to execute your part to like perfection. I was just out on a job site not too terribly long ago, and I was talking with the plumbers there because that's the trade I come out of. It was so rad. Like what they were doing is this journeyman was working with an apprentice, kind of bringing him along. And so these guys were like bragging about their soldering skills, and they were going off and like showing like how clean their joints were. Like, you know what I mean? And it's just like these guys were like kind of encouraging each other on, and like it just made me like envious. I'm like, where were you guys when I would have hired you guys so quickly? You had no idea. Like where you see people are like enthusiastic, and they're like literally putting their stickers on top of their stuff of like celebrating it, taking pictures on their phones, sharing it with their buddies. It's like that is like, I found that to be inspiring, and like, yeah, like, or you could look at it as I'm just soldering pipe, dude, whatever. I'm sweating this together. And you can tell when it's a garbage weld, but these guys, like, it was clean welds, and like, it just was like they took their craft seriously. And I thought that was like super cool. And there's just a bunch of plumbers, a bunch of grubby plumbers, piling out of a van at 7 a.m. in the morning to get on the job site. And they may or may not be hungover. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like they did care about their job. And that was pretty rad.
Yeah.
When I started, before I started spinning, I had a friend who spun, and she had sheep, and she was, her and her husband were retiring. They sold their farm, sold their sheep, and she had bags and bags and bags of fleece. And she said to me one day, "Do you want some fleece? I'll give you some." And I said, "For what?" "Well, you knit. Don't you spin?" I said, "No, I don't have time to spin. If I was spinning, how would I knit?" Right? And then she said, "Oh, you would love it. Why don't you just come and get some wool? And then if you don't want it, you can throw it in the garbage, throw it in the dump. I'm going to throw the rest of them in the dump anyways, so it wouldn't hurt my feelings. I'll just give you some." So she gave me 25 fleeces. I still have some.
Oh, wow.
And I had nothing. I had no tools to work the fleeces. I didn't know anything about wool. I knew nothing. And I remember my husband's like, "What are you going to do with that stuff?" And I said, "I don't know. I guess maybe I should look at it." So I grabbed a bag and opened it up and pulled it out, and I put it on my face, and I smelled it, and I was like, "Oh, this smells so good." And then I was like, "This feels really," and I was a knitter. Okay. So I knew what wool could do and what I could make with wool. And then I started doing this thing with it, and I was going, look at it. It's just, it wants to be spun. Oh my God. This is amazing. Like, this is the most amazing material. And then I started just like nerding out over this fiber, right? And then a YouTube video, how to wash your wool. Okay, wash it all up. Oh my gosh, it's so soft now. Okay, well, now I need a spindle. I need some carders, but what was really cool about it was the whole time I was doing it, I thought it's the way I wanted to do it, because what ended up happening was I entered into this primitive state of mind.
Yes.
I could imagine myself, right, as some, I don't know, Mongolian in the desert, with my sheepskin, right? Like, what am I going to do with this? And so then I started looking at all these like primitive videos of people processing fiber.
Mhm.
And anyway, I'm going to nerd out on you guys if I keep going here. So I won't,
it.
but it was just, it was such an interesting experience to go and start out with absolutely no idea, just have like an intuition about, like, love the smell of it, love the way it works,
Mhm.
like the thing that it wants to do all by itself. No wonder they thought about spinning it, because look at it, it just wants to be spun,
Mhm.
and then discovering this thing as you go along, and like Luke was talking about, suddenly you're at a stage, you get to a place in your craft where you realize that you're actually mastering it, that you can start applying all the principles to all kinds of, like, you can just dance, right?
Mhm.
You just do stuff.
Okay, I got a question for everybody here, because like that makes me think of like the first person who encountered that
Mm.
reality when they were working with wool, of
I-
like, oh, it wants to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, so like the world, like some of the most ancient myths in the world are weaver myths.
Oh, so
Mm.
interesting.
Like, so one of the most ancient myths in the world is reflected in a goddess called Chinyu, and she was a Central Asian goddess that got imported into the East as Chinyu in the Chinese area. But this is like at the upper limit of the Stone Age, right? And then it gets reflected in Western mythology with like Arachne. Athena was a weaver, right? So the legend and myth of Arachne was like, she was actually more skilled at weaving than Athena was, and so Athena turned her into a spider, right?
Mm. And did you know that Mary, Christ's mother,
Right,
was a weaver
right.
That.
in the
What?
temple?
And what was okay? So, well, okay, like, so one of like my psychedelic experiences, I encountered Chinyu in like this psychedelic experience. This was years ago. And I was going through like she transformed into like this white spider, right? And I had this, and she went under the name of Sunday. She had 8 legs. It was the 8th day. Interesting. And so we had like this interesting theological conversation. It's like, tell me what you think about Jesus, because if I encounter some weird thing, I want to know what they had to think about Jesus, right? And she went on and on about it. It was really cool. And then she started to weave this, because I was going through a rough time. And so I was using psychedelics therapeutically. Somebody had recommended, hey, try it. I was going through a really tough depression. And so I had recommended to use mushrooms. And so I did. And it was helpful. It was a helpful experience. And like, she weaved this web of light over the top of me. Right. And it was because I needed to face the darkness, and the light would protect me so I could see the darkness for what it was.
Mm.
And so I had this like a really interesting conversation with this goddess in this psychedelic experience, right? And I went back and I researched it, and like it checks out. Like, what she had told me was her story from her myth, which was she was like a weaver, and that she was in love with a shepherd boy or a cowherd, depending on the myth. And she could not be like, she wasn't tending to her weaving duties. Well, it just so happens that her weaving duties were to weave the dawn. So she was weaving the sunrise. That was her job.
Oh.
And so the sky father was her father. And like, in order to make sure that she would tend to her duties, she put a river between herself and her lover, the shepherd or the cowherd. And he could only cross over once a year. And that river symbolizes the Milky Way. Right. And so, but like, so there's like this, like that technology of weaving was always viewed as something that was divinely imparted. Right. And it's reflected in the mythologies that are all around us. I mean, you even see the negative reflection of that in Genesis 4, where, or Genesis 4 through 6, like where technology is kind of bound up in the, these divine beings making trouble by introducing technologies that humans weren't ready for or weren't designed for. Right. And, but like that whole image speaks to me is like, so it's like, what is it about like that creative process, that aha moment? I know it kind of had a long and winding way to get there. Like, what is it about like that aha moment that you realize, oh, this thing wants to do this? Like this character wants to go in this direction, or this poem wants to write itself this way. Like, what is that? Because
I know that's the thing. I think that George MacDonald says doesn't come from us. Like, there your thought stands before you. Where did it come from? Right? He actually poses the question, and I have to say, like, I've kind of fought tooth and nail not to spin wool. Like, I had a few people, they kept bugging me. And I just was like, I don't know why you think I should spin wool. Like, I'm no desire to spin wool. Like, what are you doing? And now I have sheep, and the thing that's really interesting to me is I got these Gotland sheep, and I don't even really know why I got Gotland sheep. And it wasn't until after, like, I just had this idea in my head. I don't even know where it came from, to be honest with you, to get Gotland sheep. And then, so I looked it up if there was a breeder in BC, and there was one. And anyway, I got these sheep. And then after the fact, I find out that they're a rare breed, that they've only been in Canada since 2012. And that they were bred by the Vikings through, they bred different sheep together to come up with these sheep, and that Tolkien used them in his story as the source for the elven cloaks, because he saw them on a walk once in the UK, and they have a silver fleece, and it was twilight, and he felt like that they were wearing the twilight, right? And so then he says in the story somewhere, I don't know where it is, that these sheep, that it was from Gotland wool that the elven cloaks were made, right? And so then all this stuff is happening, and I never, like, I didn't go to get a rare breed. I didn't go to get a sheep that Tolkien talked about. I didn't, none of that, right? And then I'm spinning up this wool, and it's taking me into these enchanted places. Like,
well, it's taking you into the realm of the goddesses, and it's taking you into the realm of the Mother of God, for heaven's sake.
Yeah,
you stand in the legacy of, like, you stand.
It truly is.
Legacy, and so you're connecting to that. You're connecting to that reality, and like that's where sometimes like those ancient technologies, like these ancient methods and techniques, can be really powerful.
Well, and it's also a journey into the feminine, a feminine, the feminine that is lost, gone, the one who Proverbs 31 talks about, the one who considers a field and buys it, the one who, right? Like, you realize when you're working with these animals, all the work that these women put into the care of their families, right? And not only that, but in Mongolia, they build their yurts out of them, right? Like, they have these. The whole yurt is made from sheep fleeces, and then the whole community gets together, and they have this process, right, where they make the walls of the yurt, and then they eat the sheep and they drink their milk, and anyway, it just took me down a road that I fully didn't expect, right? And now I'm at a place, so now I'm knitting garments with this wool, and I get to see what it's doing. And it's not your regular kind of wool. It's actually very, very soft. It doesn't have a lot of memory, so it doesn't spring. It's kind of loose, drapey when you knit it up. And so now I'm like, okay, so now the Vikings that bred this, why did the Vikings want a wool
Yeah.
that draped? Oh, because guess what? They didn't knit. They wove. Okay.
Whoa.
And so they needed a fine, soft fiber that wasn't crunchy and scratchy and right. It needed to drape. And then now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, these people are elegant.
Mhm.
Right now I'm entering into this Viking mentality, right? And it's just such an interesting journey. I'm telling you,
Mhm.
it's so fascinating.
Mhm.
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah, no, it everything you're talking about reminds me of just like the foray into the natural dyeing world that I as it's developed in my wife and I's life over the last
Mhm.
however many years. It's just like an endless like rabbit hole.
And
With
not
so
only that, let me say one more thing. I'm just gonna go full
Sure.
nerdy on you guys, okay? So I have these Gotland sheep, and again after the fact, I find out that they're naturally hornless, they're naturally short-tailed. So what a lot of shepherds have to contend with horns. They have to contend with docking tails, or they call it crutching. So they have to, before summer sets in, they've got to shave around the tail head and stuff because poop gets stuck in there, and then flies lay eggs, and the maggots eat into the flesh of the sheep. And my sheep don't have that problem. Okay, so they're like these perfectly low maintenance sheep, and they're also not flighty. They're very friendly. And I'm
Just like
going,
the Vikings.
and I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Now these Vikings knew what they were doing. Like they have these low maintenance animals, right?
Yeah.
And they were from the island, the Gotland Islands in Sweden, which is poor vegetation. And during drought, they are the only known animal that can drink salt water and live. So they fully adapted to drinking salt water, these sheep. Okay.
I want to try that.
So I'm like, okay, so these sheep are just like incredible. Like you could just throw them out onto a desert and they'll survive, with salt
Wow.
water. So like an oceanfront desert. And so then I decide to get some chickens, and I just thought, oh, I'm going to grab some of these Icelandic chickens. They look really nice, and they lay eggs in the wintertime. So that's cool. So I buy them, and the lady that I buy them from says, so what do you have on your farm? And I said, well, I've got Gotland sheep. And she goes, oh, now you got Viking sheep. Now you got Viking chickens. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I never put that, of course. So now I have these Viking chickens. And
So, Sherry, just quickly, so if we see you like navigating a waterway in a well-crafted boat, do we need to like watch that out? Like, what's going on here?
I'm totally, I don't know why I'm entering the world of the Vikings. Okay, like it's not even planning it.
He's getting ready to stage a raid of like the Sacramento River area from British Columbia. Like, are you just gonna have hordes of Canadians coming down as the Neo Vikings?
Well, what's super interesting is these chickens are so freaking hardy, and they're really beautiful, and they're all different. They don't have a standard of color. So every single one of them has different markings and different colors. And the roosters are incredibly aggressive, but they're not big, eh? So like I got my car the other day, and one of my roosters was like, they kept charging at my car. I'm like, are you kidding me? Making these long strides,
Thinking it's a fair fight.
Yeah.
I got this.
Anyway, it's just, and having these two Viking animals, I said to my husband, man, I'm really getting a feel for these Viking people, man. They knew what they were doing, right? They needed things to just go smoothly. They needed these animals to be able to look after themselves. They needed to be highly functional and beautiful. And beautiful. Like that was really top of the list for them. The chickens are beautiful and the sheep are beautiful, right? Anyway, it's just really, and I just discovered it by participating in their world, like really stepping back in time.
Yeah, there's like even like with those cultures, what's really rad about the Vikings, there's a cool documentary. I think you can actually find it on YouTube. And I'm gonna have to get going here pretty soon, but it's about the Ulfbrecht sword. It's a Viking sword, one of the most famous swords that's ever been found, and they found a few of them. It's the way it was made, the way that they constructed the steel 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
It takes modern technology to even be able to replicate how well the steel is welded and laminated, as far as just the different layers that go into this thing. And so they had a master swordsman, swordmaker, like a blacksmith, come in and do a reconstruction using their methods and techniques. And it took this guy like 5 or 6 tries to be able to replicate what they had accomplished just with their own tools. Like, it was really cool. Like that level of craft is pretty awesome. But I'm going to have to get going because I got a phone call that came in that I got to take.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to duck out, but I love this conversation, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Jed. Bye.
Let me remove myself here.
Got it. I'm going to have to go here soon. Well, we didn't get finished, you guys. We're having too much fun.
Next time.
I think actually the next paragraph seemed to be very closely related to a lot of stuff that Jed was saying too, about like the intellectual structure and the architect and things like that.
Yeah.
So we kind of got through it without even reading it. I feel like a little bit.
We're almost there. It's okay.
Really
I love just hanging on these ideas and riding the waves, and
it's been so much fun.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to find out where to get these Icelandic chickens at.
I know, that's what I'm trying to think. Can I get one of these chicks sent to me in the mail from Sherry's homestead?
Yeah,
I doubt it.
The late like that. My house I used to live in, I used to walk to her place and she sells different chickens. So I was looking on her website, but she didn't have any. But she does sell emus. And last time I went there, have you guys ever seen those eggs? Those eggs are gorgeous.
I've seen.
They're like bright green, beautiful.
I knew a guy that had some.
Yeah, I had a buddy named Caleb who used to have like 6 or 7 of them, and he would extract there's like a oil sac right above their anal gland.
Okay.
And you can extract the oil from it, and it's a highly sought after like cosmetic oil, for makeup companies or whatever. It sells for like $16 an ounce.
So these emus are cool with that?
I never saw an extraction take place. So I
heard that they have a good kick. So,
yeah, I wouldn't want to stand behind one. They were nasty. That's like an ostrich.
We went to this guy's farm one time and he had 2 emus and the male was sitting on the eggs. And the male's name was Uli. And that's my husband's name. I'm like, oh, look, honey. He's doing housework.
That was funny.
He's doing housework. Oh my gosh. Did you make a scrambled egg out of one, Jason?
No, I haven't had the eggs. I just saw her because she was hatching them. But they were really pretty eggs. But I did actually my cousin Lily had some people she knew that had an ostrich farm. So she got me an ostrich egg, and I did scramble one of those eggs.
Wow.
But it was a lot. I don't know the right way to describe it. I want to say tougher, but it wasn't. That's not the right word. I think it's just a lot.
My husband's. I have 2 geese, and this year she actually just tonight started setting. So she laid her eggs in the chicken coop. Thank goodness, because she'll find a spot somewhere on the property and lay her eggs. And what she does is she lays them over a period of, she lays every second day for till she has about 12 or 13 eggs. And she just covers them over with a little bit of grass, right? And the ravens see it and they just swoop down and grab it. And, and it was at a point there last year where she'd be on her nest outside, and the raven would be standing beside her waiting. As soon as she laid her egg, he was like, see the raven fly by with this giant white thing in his beak.
Mhm.
But she's setting now. She's got 13 eggs, I think. And just tonight, I went to put them away before I came down for this. And just the male was out and I got scared because I thought maybe a coyote got her. But then I peeked in the chicken coop and she was on the nest.
What? That's so cool.
So now she'll sit for 30 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. She's not going to emerge until June.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
cool. That's nice too, because then when they hatch, she'll actually have a mother taking care of them. It's the problem with
Yeah.
buying chicks. Is like those things perish so easily, and
Mhm.
they don't have a mother to protect them, and it's just like
Yeah.
It is kind of
Yeah. If you can find Icelandic chickens, they're great. I love them.
I'll have to look
I'm
for that. I
really
also wanted
into-
to get Swiss chickens because apparently that's a thing too. My last name is like our family's Swiss, so
Yeah.
I thought
I've
that'd be
heard
fun
of
to
them.
have those. But well, I can't remember. I think you just put in Swiss chicken. I don't know if that's what they're called, but let me see. Swiss
If I
chicken.
can just find like non-vaccinated heritage breeds, that would be cool.
It's called. Oh, see, it's called the Schweitzer chicken. So it's a chicken
What?
breed. That's my last name. My last name is Schweitzer. That's why I need to get one.
Jason.
I
Like,
put Swiss.
you
I
Google
put Swiss
Swiss chicken.
chicken in Google, and it came up with a whole bunch of recipes.
Oh,
That makes
Schweitzer
sense.
chicken. Oh, it's got some fancy hair. Like, or wait, maybe this other one has. Let's see.
My Icelandic chickens, they have earlobes, Jason, and they're iridescent green and yellow. Oh, I'm telling you, these Vikings,
Wow.
they had an eye for beauty.
Earlobes. That's crazy.
Yeah. Oh,
Dropped
these
it
guys
in the
are
private
white.
Chat. It's Swiss chickens. But that's Schweitzer chicken. That's my name.
They're white.
Dang.
Yeah.
There's so many chicken breeds out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's got to be some really, I don't know, some really cool ones that I'm not privy to yet.
Have you seen the Silkies?
Yeah,
Yeah.
with the little bedazzled toes.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yep.
we happen to have quite a few Nordic pagans living around. And I'm pretty sure the lady I bought from, because she knew right away that my sheep were Viking bred. Most people, they may, if they've heard of Gotland sheep, they know them as a Swedish breed. They wouldn't right away clue into them being Viking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
That is interesting.
I had a couple come out one time. I bought a billy goat from them, and they were right totally into it. He had like the little beard with the ring in it, and
Tattoos.
they were all excited because I had Norwegian fjord horses, and they were like, "Those are Viking horses!"
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Vikings were supposedly these well-built creatures themselves, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just super interesting to me that they had, like, I've worked with a number of different kinds of wool, and most of it is very scratchy and very uncomfortable and makes you itchy, and but not this stuff. It's really nice. And yeah, that they went to the trouble to breed an animal that give them something really beautiful and elegant and You know,
Yeah.
that's super
Yeah.
interesting to me.
I don't even know how someone does that. Like, I don't even know how you are like, hey, if we crossbreed this with this, it'll have
Well,
perfect wool.
there was a wild breed of sheep on that island. I can't remember the name of it now. They still exist. And they bred that because it was hardy to the place. And you have to remember they traveled everywhere, right? Then they had Romanov sheep from, where are they from? I can't remember. Anyway, I don't know. And they added those to the mix with something else. I can't remember what. So yeah,
That's cool.
it is.
I loved it. I could listen to you nerd out about
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
sheep and chickens and oh, it's so good.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I just like listening to it too because you're talking about your journey with spinning, and like as that's happening, it's like the divine weaver is also weaving it all together. You're
Yeah,
just doing, and it's
I
just
know. And at the same time, I'm inquiring into orthodoxy, and then I meet the Theotokos, and then I find out that she was weaving in the temple, and
that's crazy.
you know, the
Wow.
whole thing, eh? The whole thing kind of just
Yeah,
Yeah.
spins itself into a yarn.
yeah,
Dying.
yep. That's
crazy.
cool.
Well, I'm gonna end the broadcast.
All right.
Hang on,
I'm gonna
guys.
go to sleep.
Thanks for tuning
Yeah.
in, people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
thank
a
you.
lot.
You're going to sleep.